Hello, thanks very much for having me. Today I'm going to talk about decolonising natural science collections by sharing their data. Many museum collections would not have taken shape without colonialism. The British Empire effectively funded thousands of well-armed and well-resourced collectors and posted them to countries around the world. These collectors were in positions of power and able to exploit indigenous people to do much of the work of collecting. As well as benefiting from the natural heritage of their lands, indigenous people were exploited and sometimes died in the pursuit of natural history collecting. Some indigenous people even became part of museum collections themselves. Natural science specimens exist in our museum collections today as a result of the inequitable and sometimes violent history of the British Empire. The wealth held in our collections, in their data, financial income and scientific and educational value, represent deficits felt elsewhere today. So what is decolonisation? To my mind, decolonising natural science collections involves recognising and acknowledging this history and taking steps to right persisting imbalances between historically colonising and colonised countries. This is a picture of a gallery in Tring, part of the Natural History Museum in London. The colonial nature of museum natural science collections is so deeply ingrained that we rarely question it. But once you start looking, there are examples everywhere. We're used to working with collections that include specimens from all over the world and conditioned to think that this is just the way that museums are. Understanding the natural history of colonies was important to the British Empire in terms of knowledge of potential resources and scientific discovery. The specimens collected in the pursuit of this knowledge by soldiers, missionaries and others in the colonial network were often transported back to British museums. Colonial history results in geographic biases found in European collections. British museums, for example, are far better stocked with specimens from countries in the former British Empire than regions where Great Britain was not the colonial power, such as Russia or China. On the other side of the coin, it's hard to imagine going to a museum in East Africa and finding cabinets full of British insects or walls covered with British trophy heads. As well as museum specimens themselves, the legacy of colonialism is also found with their associated data. This can take the form of their species name, for example, species named after colonial powers, or it can involve racist terminology being used in species names, or the deletion of indigenous names for species or places. This is something that different groups have started working on, but with millions of natural science specimens held in museums, it will take a long time to remove or explain racist words on specimen labels. The names given to animals and plants often honour people, particularly white men with money and power, and they can reflect colonial history. Here is an example of Victoria's riflebird. On the left is a female specimen from Leeds museums and galleries. The right is a male from Naturalis, and in the middle is a pair in happier times. So Victoria's riflebird was named in honour of Queen Victoria, who was ruler of the British Empire when Gould described the species in 1850. It lives in Queensland, which is also named in honour of Queen Victoria, and in an area around Cairns, which is named after William Cairns, who was Governor of Queensland in 1876. The name riflebird is a reference to the velvety appearance of the male's plumage and its similarity to the uniform of the British Army Rifle Brigade, which adds another layer of violence to its nomenclature. Before the so-called discovery of Victoria's riflebirds, they were named duo by the indigenous Yidingi people of North Queensland. The name duo provides a way into finding out more about the history and language of indigenous Australians, rather than simply name-checking figures from the British Empire. Just as places named after Queen Victoria are being returned to their indigenous names in Australia, perhaps it's time for this to happen more with scientific names. The wealth of our collections, in terms of data, but also financial income, represent a deficit elsewhere. So when I'm not being a curator, I'm working on a PhD on the colonial history of captive gorillas, and gorilla specimens in museums serve as good examples of the ways in which colonial history still leaves other marks on our collections. On the left is the Akeley Hall of African mammals in the American Museum of Natural History, and the right is the gorilla display, which is part of this. The gallery is named after the taxidermist Carl Akeley, who killed several of the gorillas on display in the gallery today. Or did he? So a key piece of data for museum labels and biological records generally is the collector's name. However, this is usually the name of the white man who led the collecting expedition, rather than any of the huge numbers of other people involved. Hundreds of African men were involved in Akeley's expeditions, working as porters, hunters, guides, and personal staff. As well as putting themselves in danger while tracking and hunting animals, their labour was exploited for tasks such as carrying needless kit, and even in this case, carrying one of Akeley's companions' small child. On the left here are some of his porters carrying equipment, and little 5-year-old Alice being carried on a tipoy by some of the African employees. On the right is Carl Akeley working on a gorilla skin, and beneath him there are some unnamed African labourers who are removing meat, or removing flesh rather, from a gorilla skeleton. Akeley has a whole gallery named after him, but the many African people he depended on to collect the specimens in it receive no credit. Does this really matter? Some people think it should all be left in the past. I think it does matter because the effects of colonial history are still felt today. The legacies of colonial era collecting aren't limited to giving credit where it's due. Museum collections and their associated data, as with other biological records, are hugely valuable. The long-lasting effects of colonialism can be seen in the way gorilla specimens are currently distributed. So in 2018, Cooper and Hull published a global catalogue of gorilla remains. The catalogue is 224 pages in length and represents many thousands of gorilla specimens. So I, just using the very rough measure of page numbers rather than actual specimens, this chart shows where gorilla remains today are stored. So 4% are in Belgium, which isn't surprising because of the Belgian Congo and the amount of gorillas that did live there. France has 7% of gorilla remains, and Germany 12%, presumably because of its colonial links with Rwanda and Cameroon. The UK has 25% of gorilla remains. So that's 25% of gorilla remains in the world are in the UK, and the US also has 25%. Africa has 2% of gorilla remains. And of these specimens in Africa, most are in research facilities rather than in publicly accessible museums. This chart shows the provenance of gorilla remains where the data is known. So a large proportion come from Cameroon, and then, as I would expect, from other countries where gorillas are found, so Gabon, Republic of the Congo, DRC, and Equatorial Guinea. Now, currently, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which was a Belgian colony, the Republic of the Congo, which was French, Cameroon, which was variously British, French, and German, and Gabon, which was French. None of these countries have preserved gorilla remains in. So that means that the countries where gorillas still live, researchers and public have little access to gorilla data and the educational and research value they hold. Given that both species of gorilla are critically endangered, this doesn't seem to be the best use of specimens, to my mind. And even the dustiest and mankiest looking museum specimens can be useful for current conservation efforts. This on the left here is a Tasmanian devil in the Leeds Museums and Galleries collections, and data from it was used in a recent paper linked to Tasmanian devil research, and I'll give you the reference at the end. The researchers got in touch with Leeds Museums and Galleries via a call out on the NATSCA JISC list, which is the Natural Sciences Collections Association, which we responded to. But really, the data involved should have been available online freely, which is something we are still persisting in working on. So what can we do about all of this? There's the option of repatriating animal and plant remains and of other groups. And this is rarely done beyond human remains, and it's very rarely proactive. People generally need to know that a museum has something before they can ask for it back, which is a whole other issue, which I better not get into, otherwise I'll never stop. But in the absence of repatriation of specimens, data sharing is incredibly important. It's not only the first step for repatriation, but it holds its own value and can be shared more widely, more cheaply, and with far more different parties than museum specimens. It's also potentially much more useful for countries from which specimens were collected. So scientific data associated with museum specimens can be found in museum databases, but as those of you who work in museums know, these are far from perfect, and many are really not even fit for purpose, which again is another thing I better not get into. The Natural History Museum are currently working on a project which would hopefully produce a national database, which would be a lot more useful for a lot more people. Some museums' data automatically goes to aggregators which are more accessible to people around the world. In the case of Leeds Museums and Galleries, our setup is a lot more clunky, but we have been able to export some data to the National Biodiversity Network and GBIF. This means that people can access data much more widely, especially scientists and specialists. However, this kind of data is impenetrable to many people. You tend to need to know what you're looking for and whether it's there before you can begin to find it. And the other problem, of course, is that many places don't have internet access, or if they do, it's patchy or costly. And of course, researchers aren't the only people who can benefit from museum data. Engaging the public with biological records will likely become more important for biodiversity conservation, for example, through citizen science projects and apps such as iNaturalist. Museums can use their museum specimens to share data in a targeted and accessible way to non-specialists. Exhibitions and events can be used to share deeper stories of selected specimens, and some museums with natural history collections have been doing a lot more of this, doing tours of colonial histories. So the University of Cambridge and the Natural History Museum are both doing this, for example. At Leeds Museums and Galleries, we're currently redisplaying our Life on Earth gallery, and decolonisation will be a big part of this, and we're going to tell more detailed histories of these specimens you see here. Where the internet is freely accessible, online engagement can be a useful way of sharing data and engaging people, combining hard data with curatorial public engagement skills. We did a lot of this during lockdown, as I expect many of you did. This is My Learning, which is an educational resource platform. And this is Google Arts and Culture, where you can upload anything that's got a half-decent image, basically. But it's also a good place to do online exhibitions, which obviously can reach a lot more people than traditional exhibitions. Another way in which sharing data can help decolonise natural science collections is through partnership projects. So currently I'm working with Jodie Payton at the UK Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, and partners in Mice Botanic Garden, the Overseas Territories Conservation Forum, the National Trust in Cayman Islands and Montserrat National Trust, looking at ways in which colonialism has affected conservation in overseas UK overseas territories. But the biggest barrier, I think, to decolonising collections is curators needing to learn more and wanting to learn more about it. Decolonisation isn't just for human collections, but really natural science collections are human collections when you start looking more deeply. The remains of animals from once colonised countries have the potential to reveal stories of the people whose lives were affected by colonisation. The legacy of empire is evident in the colonial nature of conservation in ex-colonies today, which continues to impact the quality of life of many people in a way that may not be sustainable for people or wildlife. Decolonising our collections can help us engage our audiences with a range of political and environmental issues still relevant today and which directly help conservation. Here are some of the references I used in this presentation, as well as some resources that you may be interested in. And that's all. Thank you very much.